Hi, I'm Eric, and you're watching Sideboard MTG here on YouTube Gaming. Today's video is brought to you by Mana Traders, a quick and easy to use rental service for Magic Online and Magic the Gathering in paper. If you want to sign up for Mana Traders, check the link in the description box below, along with the coupon that'll save you 15% on your first 3 months. What's up, everyone? So today we're going to be talking about Boros. Yeah, we're talking about the top 8 decks, and 6 of the top 8 decks were Boros aggro. So I am gonna hit on the Boros aggro decks, but I know you guys don't want a video just on Boros aggro. So I did go ahead and pull a couple of the additional lists that I think will be very interesting. I've got Brad Nelson's Golgari along with Reed Duke's Golgari list, Shota's Grixis control deck, and a couple other pretty sweet decks that I think that are worth looking at. So let's kind of jump into it. I've got a list of Boros core cards pulled up in front of us here. And we're going to talk about these cards in particular, how they make up the backbone of all of the top 8 Boros list. So we might as well start here with Venerated Loxodon. Venerated Loxodon is one of those cards that allowed the decks to grow in size a little bit. Instead of just being small white weenie creatures, you're getting an extra power and toughness added to these. When you pair that with cards like Benalish Marshal, your creatures get even larger, allowing you to swing into much larger board states. And then, of course, as far as like other one-of cards or other cards that some of the decks ran and didn't run, we've got Dauntless Bodyguard. Now, as far as Dauntless Bodyguard goes, Benalish Marshal and Venerated Loxodon, these are the only cards that weren't really found in all of the list. The rest of the cards that I have pulled up for you guys here were found in all or 5 out of the 6 lists. All the lists have some number of Conclave Tribunals. All of the lists have 4 Histories of Benalia and 4 Adanto Vanguard. Now, not all of the lists have 4 Healer's Hawk. Some of them only have 2 copies of Healer's Hawk, and most of them do have 4 copies of Legion's Landing. Legion's Landing was absolutely instrumental in a couple of the games that I got a chance to watch, so it looks like it played a really big part in these decks, allowing them to play a threat early in the game and then ramping them an additional card, because most of these decks only ran like 20 main board lands, so flipping their Legion's Landing was a big part of the plan. And when you see the sheer number of 1-drops that most of these decks have, it makes it really easy to understand that why they could count on flipping a Legion's Landing for that 4th or even that 3rd land. Now, most of the decks did run some number of Skymarcher Aspirant. Skymarcher Aspirant, not the only flying creature that was run. We did see the Healer's Hawks, even a version with a Rustwing Falcon, but for the most part, it was just Skymarch Aspirant and Healer's Hawks as the flying threats. Now, that is like the backbone of these decks. Now, 2 of the decks did not have the sideboard Tocatli Honor Guards, LSV's deck, and the other deck that was kind of akin to LSV's deck did not have Tocatli Honor Guard. The rest of the list did have Tocatli Honor Guard. When we look at the first place list and we look at the 7th place list, we'll notice that the main 60 in these lists is identical. If we do look at the sideboard of those lists and you want to see like what the differences are, you've got 2 Baffling Ends, a Tajik, and a Make a Stand were in the 7th place list. However, in the first place list, Andrew went for an additional copy of Ajani, 2 copies of Response to Resurgence, and then a singleton copy of Banefire as his other 4 cards, if you will. But there were only 4 cards out of the 75 that were not the exact same in the 7th place and the 1st place list, showing you that 2 versions or 2 copies of this almost identical versions of this deck made it into the top 8, which I thought was quite interesting. And all of these lists are running the Skymarcher Aspirants, Legion's Landing, Dauntless Bodyguard, couple copies of Healer's Hawk, Adanto's Vanguard, History of Benalia, Benelish Marshal, Venerated Loxodon, and Conclave Tribunal. The same core that I pulled out for you guys earlier is in this list. This core is 100% in most of these lists, and I think that this is basically all you need to be able to build one of these decks. Now, basically moving here forward, I'm just going to talk about what the decks did that was slightly off of that core. How did each player kind of adjust their deck to be off of that core? And let's talk a little bit more about what that core does for a deck list. And then we'll kind of, talk about why they might have chosen to not play a particular card, or why they wanted to play some other card instead. And then, so as we look at the first place list, yes, it was 100% on that core. It did run some of its additional slots as Pride of Conquerors, and then Snubhorn Sentry. That's pretty much the only room that they had to put, a couple Snubhorn Sentries, a couple Pride of Conquerors. They cut down on some of the Healer's Hawks to make room for that, but the rest of the list is, that core that I mentioned earlier. Now, when we look at LSV's list, he actually cut down on one of the Sky Marcher aspirants, did not go for the Venerated Loxodon, instead chose a Johnny's Pride Mate. Now, with the Johnny's Pride Mate, that put more emphasis on the Healer's Hawk. So he went with a full 4 of on the Healer's Hawks, and then instead of a couple of the other cards, like cutting down on some of the Conclave Tribunals and things of that nature to make room for Leon and Vanguard, which is another way to trigger the Johnny's Pride Mate. Now, in this version of the deck, LSV was trying to go a little bit taller instead of wider with his version of the deck. Now, he does still get to go very wide because there's a 19 1-drops here. But for the most part, he's really just trying to gain those extra little bits of life, and then have a much larger creature that he can continue to swing into their board with, or at least trade his Johnny's Pride Mate for 2 or even 3 of their creatures, gaining a lot of value there. Now, this list did really well, and personally, I think that the Johnny's Pride Mate list might have done, even better if LSV hadn't have had to mulligan, and he did mulligan down to 4 in the final game, which is brutal. But all in all, I really like this list. But it's not that much different from the size gain of the first place list. Benelish Marshal and Venerated Loxodon do allow the first place list to really buff up their board presence, having much bigger creatures. When we move on to the third place list, we'll see that this is actually more of a Boros, an actual Boros deck with some red cards. Now, this deck has Goblin Instigator, and it wanted to go wider. The main reason it wanted to go wider is because it wanted to use Heroic Reinforcements as its 4-drop. Instead of using something like Venerated Loxodon or things of that nature, this deck went with Aurelia and Heroic Reinforcements. Now, the benefit of going wide means that you get to add more power and toughness to the board the turn that you activate, or that you cast your Heroic Reinforcements. Putting more power onto the board at that point then lets you swing wider. And this list went for more of an alpha strike type win. It does have cards like Boros Challenger in it instead of cards like Healer's Hawk. We also seen Haunted Witness because the deck really wants to keep more like creatures on the battlefield. Haunted Witness played really well into Deafening Clarions, things of that nature, so that they're still left with a threat on the battlefield. And then of course there was still some Pride of Conquerors. Most of these lists do have a couple copies of Pride of Conquerors. Maybe I should have put this actually in the core part of the decks, as LSV was running 3 copies of this. The first place deck was running a couple copies. Third place is running a couple copies. The fourth place list here, however, is kind of a combination of the first place deck and the third place deck, running Heroic Reinforcements, but really a mono white deck at heart. The only red card in the main board here is Heroic Reinforcements, and he's not all in on that. Only 3 copies. Now, we do see in the sideboard of this particular deck, more experimental frenzies, things of that nature, but a lot of the same things we've seen from the other decks, response to Resurgence. We see a little bit of Lyra here because he brings in the lands, he goes up on his land count. Some of the decks ran Baffling in, some of the decks did not run Baffling in. Make a Stand showed up in some of the decks, and these were really good combat trick oriented decks. So I mean, if you like White Weenie with a a splash of combat tricks and things like that, if you want to play that type of aggressive aggro deck and you want the combat tricks, I really like Pride of Conquerors, but historic or historic Heroic Reinforcements is also a really good way to do it, adding a lot to the board and giving you a lot of power and toughness the turn that you do want to swing for that Alpha Strike. Now, when we look at the 6th place list, this will be one of the few lists that we look at today that even has copies of Knight of Grace. Knight of Grace has kind of fallen out of favor a little bit, but even this list still has the Dauntless Bodyguard, Sky Marcher Aspirants, Legion's Landings, Healer's Hawks, Adanto's Vanguard, History of Benalia, and Benalish Marshal, along with Conclave Tribunal. The core is still there in all of these decks. Now, this list decided it wanted to run some Aurelias and Heroic Reinforcements. Again, we see this a lot like the deck before this that had Heroic Reinforcements, but it didn't have the additional 2-drops. This deck wanted to go a little bit larger, having Venerated Loxodon. And I don't believe that there's a real bad way to go here. I think that if you're thinking about a lot of the mirror matches and things of that nature, Venerated Loxodon is going to help a lot, making your dudes that would typically pair up evenly against your opponent's copies of the same creatures with Venerated Loxodon, and can allow you to get bigger than them to have some profitable trades in combat. Now, if you don't have the option to get larger, then you're going to just need to outdraw your opponent with more Benalish Marshals and things of that nature. Have more Heroic Reinforcement swings. Being able to Heroic Reinforcement swing, Alpha swing on your turn 3 of your History of Benalia, or Chapter 3 of your history, that turn, being able to Heroic Reinforcements is absolutely wonderful. But all in all, I think that the consistency of the 1st and 7th place decks, just being to the core of the idea of the mono white deck, using a couple Pride of Conquerors, not trying to get overly fancy, not trying to have these ooh, I'm going to have this super attack here and stuff like that, because it may not always line up. All in all, I think that this is just the more consistent deck, and it won the Pro Tour. I mean, so he had a really good run with this deck. But that is all of the Boros aggro decks. I hope I spent enough time talking about Boros aggro and like the differences and the things that you can do if you want to play against the mirror, run more Benalish Marshals, run the Venerated Loxodons, have a way to get larger if you want to run LSV's version, which is, took a different approach for getting larger using the Johnny's Pride Mates. You could go that route. If you do go that route, put more emphasis on gaining life with cards like Healer's Hawk and Leon and Vanguard. But all in all, the decks are really sweet, and depending on the matchup that you think that you're going into, you might want to pick a different version of them or change your version slightly from week to week. All in all, I think that the versions that go a little bit bigger are going to have the better matchup in the mirrors. However, the versions that are a little bit lower to the ground are going to have better matchups against like control decks. They're going to be a little, maybe a half a turn faster or something like that. And then you're going to have decks like this, the 1st place deck that won the whole show just by being purely consistent. And I think Snubhorn Sentry just kind of works on that consistency, buys you a little bit of extra time so that you can have that consistency. And, all in all, I really like this version of the deck. But that wasn't the only Boros decks that were there. We did have copies of Angels that were there. Now, the best showing of Angels was in top 32, 17 through 32, we did get a version of Boros Angels. Now, even that deck had a Danto's Vanguard, had History of Benalia, Conclave Tribunal. So some of these backbone cards in the white decks are still even present in the Angels deck. Now, what made this deck a little bit different from some of the other Angels lists that I'm kind of used to is we've seen Brad Nelson have Tocatli Honor Guard in his main board and cards like Direfleet Daredevil in the sideboard. Here we have almost his exact list, minus a couple Angels, and the Direfleet Daredevils move to the main board. Along with cards like Lava Coil and Justice Strike, this gives you a lot of options to have more removal in your deck, being able to use your opponent's removal, being able to use your opponent's draw spells and things of that nature is absolutely wonderful. And I think that if you're ready for a meta full of Izzet Drakes and things like that, this may be the call that you want to make. However, if you are in a meta full of Golgari, I think that the Tocatli Honor Guards being main board might be a little bit better for you. But we did see, a top 32 finish from a Boros Angels deck. And then, of course, we had a top 32 finish from Selesnya tokens. And I will hit on this real quick as I kind of like this Selesnya tokens list. Again, Legion's Landing, Adanto Vanguard, History of Benalia, Conclave Tribunal, Venerated Loxodon. There is a theme there. Some of these white cards are extremely powerful, and being able to use them in conjunction with each other is extremely powerful. Extremely, extremely, extremely powerful. Like let's just get that out there. So like these curves are exactly where you want to be in Magic right now. It's a very, very strong curve that can take down a lot of different strategies. So, even the Selesnya tokens list that came, in 17th through 32nd place, very, very good deck. And again, running that same backbone. We do see, this being kind of the old Todd Stevens list and stuff with Saproling Migration, Amara, Soul of the Accord. Also seeing, Tristani's Flower to Flourish running, with only 20 lands. Or 21 lands, March of the Multitudes, all of these cards that we've kind of grown used to. A Johnny being in the main board, we've seen a Johnny in the sideboard in most of the Boros decks. So it's a lot like your Boros aggro decks, only splashed green for a little bit more on the top end, a little bit more late game trickery with, March of the Multitudes and things of that nature. Having, some of your lands actually, work as pump spells in the late game. Give the deck a little bit of additional reach that the Boros deck just doesn't really have. In the sideboard, we see cards like Nullhide Ferox. I was kind of wondering if this card would actually ever get any real play, but it did show up as a 4 of in the sideboard. Crawl Harpooner, which works really, really well against Lyras and other flying creatures that you just need to be able to deal with. You don't need a ton of creatures in the graveyard to have this kill something as big as a 5/5. Baffling End being able to deal with the early creatures of the format, and then Vivian Reed also helping with the flying creatures. Immortal Sun dealing with opposing Vivian Reeds, who actually ended up being a little bit bigger than Vraska in this Pro Tour. I expected Vivian to kind of still take a backseat to Vraska, but it seems that more people are on Vivian Reed. That Vivian Reed's plus ability is just absolutely wonderful. Being able to basically draw you a card in most of these decks, and that's kind of how most of these green decks worked. Just getting their Vivian Reeds down, getting their Carnage Tyrants, things like that down, continuing to draw creature spells, putting threats on the battlefield to protect their Vivian Reeds and their Ajani's and things like that. And it put up a really good fight. It's a great strategy. I like the Selesnya tokens. There's also the Selesnya aggro builds, the Selesnya mid-range builds that are not necessarily tokens, but they're running cards like Tocatli Honor Guard and stuff like that. I didn't pull up any of those because they didn't do as well as I really hoped they would. If you do want to check one of those out, just look for Selesnya mid-range here on YouTube. Seth Mansfield had a list that he played, and he actually has come back and done some gameplay of that deck list. The deck list is pretty good. Seth did not do so well with it. We seen him play against Kaibuda, and he didn't do so well there, even though that was a wonderful game. But it, all in all, the Selesnya decks didn't do near as well as I'd hoped they had. But that goes for the Golgari decks as well. When we look at Golgari, Brad Nelson played Golgari. We had Reed Duke's version of Golgari, which is not a lot different from Brad Nelson's version. As we're looking at these decks, as I flip back and forth, we're noticing that there's not really a Karn in Reed Duke's list, whereas Brad Nelson ran a copy of Karn. We've got a couple main board Wild Growth Walkers, whereas Reed Duke ran 3 Wild Growth Walkers and an Assassin's Trophy, and actually came off of some of the Seeker's Squires. If we look at Brad Nelson's list, he has no Seeker's Squires at all, but he's got Druid of the Cow, because Druid of the Cow works really well with Fine Finale. When you actually cast the Finale part of Fine Finale, you can keep your Mana Dork alive. Which isn't bad. Both of the lists are running Carnage Tyrant. Most of the lists are running Carnage Tyrant. We're seeing both of the lists running 3 copies of Vivian Reed. But the best showing of Golgari was a Golgari mid-range deck that came just outside the top 8. This deck almost made top 8, however, it did not. It is running 4 copies of Druid of the Cow, 4 copies of Merfolk Branchwalker, no main board Wild Growth Walkers, and that might be why it just got pushed out of the top 8. Just wasn't that good against the mono white decks. But having Assassin's Trophy and Cast Down to be able to deal with Tocatli Honor Guard is a real thing. Having cards like Vraska's Contempt to be able to deal with Tocatli Honor Guards is also a thing. This particular version of the deck did run multiple copies of Karn, and we seen where Seth Mansfield was talking about Karn here not a long time ago. How that it may be better than Vraska Golgari Queen. However, when everyone's playing Tocatli Honor Guards, you kind of need an extra way to kill Tocatli Honor Guard. Otherwise, all of your Explorer creatures and, Ravenous Chupacabras, your Enter the Battlefield triggers are just not going to work. We did see this deck kind of come off the Golgari Finebroker a little bit, but did keep a copy of Golgari Finebroker in the deck list so that you can get through those late game loops with Eldest Reborn and things like that. But all in all, this deck just wants a lot of card advantage and wants to be able to get into a Vivian Reed as quickly as possible, to be able to dig for the first Carnage Tyrant as quickly as possible, and then play your Carnage Tyrants and start swinging with them as quickly as possible. I mean, that's kind of the whole idea, and that's where Golgari is morphed into, is, just having Llanowar Elves, Druid of the Cow, taking those first couple turns of the game to be able to set up, and then by turn 3, you're looking at, Vivian Reed, and then by turn 4, you should have already found one of your 4 Carnage Tyrants. You're slamming a Carnage Tyrant by turn 4, and just kind of trying to take over the game from there. Now, when you don't have those perfect draws, you got some really powerful turn 4s like Karn. Vraska, even playing Vivian on 4 is okay. Getting an early Eldest Reborn down is not bad either. Having, Ravenous Chupacabra on curve or slightly before curve is never a bad thing. But all in all, the deck is just meant to power out a Vivian Reed or a really powerful Planeswalker, and then power out a Carnage Tyrant. Once once you have your draw engine online, or even if you can just get to the Carnage Tyrant quicker, because there are some plays where you can be like Druid of the Cow, or Llanowar Elf on 1, Druid of the Cow, and Llanowar Elf on 2, and then turn 3 Carnage Tyrant, go. I mean, there are those draws where you do get to do that, and a turn 3 Carnage Tyrant is probably going to spell the end of the game versus most decks. Just being able to get that much power and toughness with Trample onto the board and start swinging with it as early as turn 4 is absolutely great. And that's how you're going to win these games. And he did come in 9th through 16th place, so not bad. It was great running. I mean, definitely, at the top top of the Golgari game, it just kind of got shut down by all the Boros decks. Wild Growth Walker being in the sideboard could have done something to to affect that. Maybe if this was in the main, maybe things would have been a little bit different. However, I like this being in the side as it does open up more room for more ramp creatures, more mana dorks, which can allow you to get those more like just out of this world insane draws of cards of like turn 3 Carnage Tyrant. I mean, who doesn't want to go turn 3 Carnage Tyrant? Do something, you know? Hmm. But, we did see Brad Nelson and Reed Duke were both on the Golgari list. Brad Nelson actually had some Rituals of Sit in his sideboard, along with a couple Death Gorge Scavengers, Vraska Relic Seekers, Doom Whisperers, even a copy of Golgari Raiders, which I found to be a little bit interesting, but a late game hit with this could just be backbreaking. It enters the battlefield, it gets +1/+1 counters on it for each creature card in your graveyard. So this could be a 4 mana, just like 7/7 or 8/8 or 9/9. And then if they don't have a way to deal with it, you have this really big guy who's just swinging out of nowhere and can really turn the game around. So Golgari Raider in the sideboard looks fine to me. And then, again, that like we just didn't have a top 8 Golgari list, and that kind of surprised me a little bit. However, in the top 8, we did get a Jeskai Control. The Jeskai Control deck, I'm still a little bit on the fence about the mana here. You really need those 18 sources to be able to consistently Sinister Sabotage on turn 3, which is probably why we still have some Ionize or even Deafening Clarions for some catch-up. You'll notice this list didn't actually run Settle the Wreckage in the main board, and that's a little bit strange. You look at the sideboard, there's no Settle the Wreckage there either. Just some good easy ways to sweep the board early, and then if you need to do a late game board sweeper, you would just copy it with an Expansion Explosion. So that's kind of the plan there. Deafening Clarion, wipe the board. This looks like it would have been really well tuned to beat the Boros aggro decks, but again, having cards like Danto's Vanguard, which you can just pay 4 life, and in this matchup, paying 4 life is not that big of a deal. And then you can still swing in with your Danto's Vanguard because it survived the Deafening Clarion, or having your Dauntless Bodyguard, sacrifice itself to give something else, indestructible. So then you get to keep your Adanto's Vanguard and something else on the battlefield. And really allows you to push a lot of pressure through these Deafening Clarions. And I think that Settle the Wreckage would have helped a little bit there, as you would get around the indestructible characteristics of the mono white deck. But all in all, I really think the Deafening Clarion's in a really good spot to fight the meta right now. So I'm still a big fan of the Izzet Control deck. Now we don't see a lot of ways to win the deck in this game, or win the game in this deck. A couple Crackling Drakes, which they work really well with Teferi, being able to draw some additional cards. Teferi being able to give you more instants and sorceries to use, being able to maintain your mana because you have Teferi, being able to play the Crackling Drake and still untap some additional land after you cast your Crackling Drake and stuff. It works really, really well. And that's kind of why we see this as like the only other win con other than Teferi. Now you can Expansion Explosion someone to death, but all in all, you really just want to keep playing that control game, play the Teferi, get the Crackling Drakes down, and there's some times where you're in the late game, you hit one of these Crackling Drakes, and you now have like a 20, a 20 powered Crackling Drake there that is threatening to kill your opponent the very next turn. So they do have to deal with it. Teferi being able to like move blockers out of the way of Crackling Drake. All of these things work really well. So I like the Jeskai Control list that we've seen. However, I was also a really big fan of the Izzet Drake list that came in 5th place. Now, 5th through 8th, we did have an Izzet Drake list, 4 Enigma Drakes, 3 Crackling Drake, 4 Arclight Phoenix, 4 Goblin Electromancer, and the rest of the deck is just a bunch of ways to just cast and get more instants and sorceries in the graveyard. Discovery Dispersal, even though as we look at the mana base, you'll see that there's no way to actually cast Dispersal. Discovery works great here, being able to surveil away a couple extra cards, maybe surveil a Arclight Phoenix or something into the graveyard. The main idea of the deck is to be able to churn through the deck, and the sheer velocity at which this deck does go through the library is absolutely terrific. If you're someone who likes to see more cards in a given game, this is the deck for you. It will allow you to run lower numbers of certain cards, but that's not the game plan here. They just want this one streamlined game plan. Get down that Goblin Electromancer, cast as many instants and sorceries as they possibly can, being able to put as many Arclight Phoenixes into their graveyard, and then once they've done that, make sure that they cast at least 3 instants or sorceries before their combat step, bring back all the Arclight Phoenixes, and swing at you. Now, I do need to point out that this maximized velocity is here. Target creature gets +1/+1 and gains haste until end of turn, allowing these decks to have some really, really crazy late game draws. If your opponent does have this in the graveyard, you do need to be wary of them just clocking you for 20 just out of nowhere. They top deck a Crackling Drake, cast maximized velocity on it, all of a sudden it has haste and it's getting the additional +1. Even if this is exiled, Crackling Drake doesn't care because it counts the cards that are exiled. So, I mean, you're just taking a lot of damage really, really quick. And then, of course, that's one spell. If they can, somehow cast an additional spell, whether it be an Opt or a Charted Course, and get a couple extra spells, going there. They might be hitting you, for 15, 16 power with a Drake, plus, a couple extra Phoenixes coming at you. It's really, really hard to deal with. So, be wary of that maximized velocity. And I thought it was really cool that we did, see this deck retain at least one copy of maximized velocity as just kind of one of those, hey, gotcha kind of moments. And I think that's why we seen Yuya leave this in his deck list. This was Yuya Watanabe's list, by the way. If any of you were are fans of Yuya, I'm actually a fan of Yuya Watanabe. So, speaking of Yuya, let's look at someone else on his team. This is Shota's Grixis control list, and this will be the last deck that I'm going to cover. As I know a lot of you like Grixis, so I definitely wanted to pull Shota's list. He did top 32 the tournament. Shota did, put on a very good performance. The deck list does have a lot of 1s and 2-ofs in the deck list. One of Eldest Reborn. We do see a couple Syncopates, which is kind of becoming standard. Shota had mainboard Rituals of Soot, mainboard Disinformation Campaigns, one copy of Beacon Bolt, but kind of works as 2 copies once you finally find it. Sinister Sabotage has a few copies here. Blink of an Eye, being able to bounce any permanents, not bad, drawing that additional card. Negate as one of in the main board, along with Search for Escanta. A lot of kill spells here in Moment of Craving and Cast Down. And then, of course, some Thought Erasers to be able to rip cards out of your opponent's hand. The deck really just wants to control the game until it can land something like a Nicol Bolas or a Doom Whisper, and then just kind of take over from there. And Shota had a really good list. I like the list. I like the one of Ral Zarek in the sideboard. I'm a huge fan of the Thieves of Sanity here in the sideboard. You'll notice that his main board or his sideboard actually just assists the main board of the deck, having additional thought erasers, additional cast downs, and things like that. Just work really good with the deck, having additional Vraska's Contempts. So depending on what matchup you're going into, which one of your kill spells are going to be best in a particular situation, being able to take out some maybe bad kill spells, put in some more good kill spells. I think that with the sheer number of Adanto's Vanguard in the format is the main reason for 4 copies of Moment of Craving. This is the only card in the deck that has 4 copies in the main board, other than some lands. So it shows you right there just how important Moment of Craving was as a kill spell to Shota. And I think we should all kind of take a little something away from that. Shota put a lot of emphasis on being able to stop Adanto Vanguard. And, we should probably pay attention to that. And remember, Adanto is in all of the lists that were on the top 8 that had white, and even the only Boros Angels list that had it also had a Danto. When we looked at the Selesnya tokens list, it had a Danto. So if they have white and they're aggressive at all, do understand that they do have a Danto's Vanguard. So like most deck lists are running this as, you know, it's probably one of the best uncommons in the set or in Ixalan. So great card, and it's something that we kind of got to watch out for, guys. That's my meta coverage. Kind of went over and talked about the differences in between all of the decks. You know, kind of why someone might have chosen a particular, you know, card over, you know, some other card in their deck list. Kind of just rambled on about the decks a little bit, but I hope you guys all enjoyed, and hope you check me out in our next live stream, or any live stream for that matter. Hope to see you there. My name's Eric. You've been watching Cyborg MTG here on YouTube Gaming. Have a good one.